in this context, we see very much, the juxtaposition of the humble bicycle with different kinds of transport. The motorcycle has become, I think, and although we don't have numbers, and I would encourage some of our participants over here in Karachi to jump into this chat, we see the motorcycle as that has become, I think, very much the dominant mode of transport for a lower middle class, ordinary citizens, whereas the bicycle, that the humble bicycle has become relegated more perhaps to the inner lanes of neighborhoods for short distances. And we do see its application, in the use of everyday transport for street hawking. But, from what Aktas has captured in this image, it looks like this bicycle maybe has multiple gears. So a slightly souped up version of the more humble kind. And then we see it typically parked in little cafes and neighborhoods, dhabas, we could call them that, and shops, etc. We see its usage. It's this is a wonderful image that Aktas captured of shears, scissors, sitting on the back, and it might have been used for a very specific kind of expertise. Again, the motorcycle sitting juxtaposed with the bicycle, and with it, we still have an economy of repair associated with it. And but then the motorcycle very much now, I think, increasingly the preferred choice for carrying goods, these kinds of goods which are then sold at Kiryana stores, which are your neighborhood mom and pop stores. And then also this emergent economy of repair and selling specific kinds of bicycles, which are mountain cycles, leisure cycles. So I think this does resonate just through these very simple everyday images that Aktas has captured. Does resonate with some of the things that are happening in Kolkata, which then brings me to this question that we did bring up when we had our informal conversation a few days ago. And I completely agree with Manas's points about really sort of keeping in mind these different kinds of ontologies rather than not flattening them. My question is from a policy vantage point that with the increasing emphasis now on greening cities, on making cities risk mitigation strategies, on urban planning for given the context of the climate crisis, and an urban planning that is designed to make cities greener, less dependence on fossil fuels, etc. There is, for instance, as a part of major agendas put forth even by the United Nations, the UN Habitat, the World Bank. The World Bank is now sort of coming into Karachi in a very big way with these risk mitigation plans and strategies. There is an emphasis on using bicycles. And with it in Karachi, for instance, and my colleague Soha Makhtoom is not here today, so she was working on the Karachi Neighborhood Improvement Program, and she was looking at it, and which was a World Bank-led project. And there was extensive sort of chatter in that project about making certain central parts of Karachi friendly for bicycles. And in that context, certain kinds of lanes were going to be designed to accommodate the bicycle. But as it turned out, it didn't happen along those lines, because the question that came up was, well, who is going to hang out in these spaces? So the question of class and the particular type of user and his or her gender became a vantage point of, slight sort of tension, if I may be permitted to use that word. And if Soha were here today, she'd be able to enlighten us quite a bit more. So what ended up as the Neighborhood Improvement Project was something entirely different, essentially. Perhaps a more gentrified notion of where the bicycle fits in and the kind of improvements that are sought. So going back to Manas's point about not flattening the ontologies of how bicycles are used and for whom, so that we have a more diverse space for diverse forms of usage. But I think that there is this slippery slope, right, in terms of these green technologies, greening cities, the possibility of a certain kind of a gentrification that occurs alongside then these dynamics of displacements and evictions that are happening in cities across South Asia. That, you don't want to flatten those ontologies, but at the same time, you want to remain mindful of how these policies and plans, especially in the context of cities like Karachi, that are very, very top down, kind of end up recreating inequalities, social
mm,
and spatial inequalities, that then don't necessarily accommodate the everyday humble bicycle and his, or his user, that the user, and it's generally always male, it's not female. So I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit. And I see we have Q and A's also being
mm, mm.
posted, so maybe we can talk about it a little bit, and then we can move to some of the comments
Mm.
that are coming from our participants.
No, Noshin, the images that you showed again took me back to Calcutta. The images of Karachi that you were showing, and I'm sitting very far away from Calcutta today. It resonates, if you ask a laborer who has to cycle 70 to 80 kilometers through congested dense cities every day, fearing for his life, from speeding buses, if the person could afford, he would definitely graduate to a motorcycle, you know so it's interesting to see the kind of kirana bhandar suppliers. We still, in Calcutta, we still have, again, it's a question of wage distribution, it's a question of daily wage labor charges. It's also a question of, who are these people? Are they locals? Are they migrants? So many things play a factor in this. And of course, riding a motorbike is far easier on the body compared to riding. So really, and again, beyond a certain age, if you have special abilities, you cannot ride a bicycle. So that's one point that I wanted to emphasize. The other point that I wanted to emphasize is that, look, we're having a kind of a imported greening of cities. It's coming with certain international standards. It's coming with certain, top down parameters of what is environmentally sound. And if you speak, and I'm sure, both of us have spent several years in Singapore, when you speak to architects who are making these green buildings, in the long term, the green buildings actually uh, you know, are far more non-green than they are made out to be, in terms of the actual usage of energy and other resources to make them green. The question of equity is absolutely foundational to planning something like cycling tracks. I was reading, there are these new cycling groups who want cycling tracks in cities, and then suddenly one of them wants to qualify these tracks only for bicycles that have gears. Now, immediately we are creating a distinction, even within the cycling track. I think it's very important. Wanting to green our cities should be an endeavor that fundamentally acknowledges the labor that the entire ecology, as Manas was saying, that revolves around, bicycles as transport, as cargo vehicles, as forms of transportation through adaptation into cycle rickshaws, etc. We have to begin taking that into consideration as an already existing eco-friendly model of mobility, and then go from there, rather than the other way around. It's only where city planning and traffic planning does not take that into consideration that we're going to have more and more inequities and distinctions on the road.
Right.
Mona,
Sorry, go ahead, Manas.
no, I just wanted to actually respond to both points a little bit from the perspective of an urban designer,
Hmm.
specifically because we spent a lot of time sort of investigating the issues of incorporating non-motorized transport on roads. And one
Hmm.
of the things with it is there is a certain degree of nuance that is completely um, lost on sort of planning from a very zoomed out perspective. So when
Mhm.
we say roads, we are not. It's very hard to sort of explain to people not involved in the nitty gritties of sort of lane widths and precise right of ways
Hmm.
about how urban form across the city is very diverse. So we were, for example, if you're trying to incorporate bicycle friendly streets within neighborhoods, which is primarily where you actually need them in the first place, um, it's never a question of a cycle track because it's not possible. It's just not possible. For the most part, a standard neighborhood right away is anywhere between, you know, 9 to maximum 15 meters. And 15 meters is actually also some of the broad ones. You're probably looking at a 6 to 9 meter right away. And within that right away, there's scarcely a possibility of having a dedicated cycle track. So it is actually it bodes well for us, because if we truly look into where it's needed and what needs to be done in terms of design, it's unlikely to lead to a solution which includes bicycle lanes. It is only when big infrastructure comes in, big investment comes in, big money in general comes in into urban development, when focus is anyway shifted to the big arterial roads of the city. And no matter what you do, you know, bicycle lanes are then conflated with things like metro corridors and bus rapid transit and all the big things that come with you know, which spend concrete and tar and all that. So then it doesn't matter whether you're designing for cycles or anyone else. What you're doing is basically shifting focus away from the actual urban form of the city, from the lanes and from the byways where actually focus is needed.
So, Manas, that I was just thinking about some of the emphasis that has been put on bicycling by the former mayor of Bogota, and I'm forgetting his name now. You know, Bogota, and I think some of the other cities in Colombia were sort of the other major cities were sort of, and I visited one of them, and I'm now forgetting the name. It wasn't Bogota; it was the other one. It was for one of the UN Habitat conferences. And as an urban planner, sorry.
Maybe Quito.
No, it wasn't Quito either. Medellin, sorry, Medellin. So I was in Medellin.
Medicine. Yeah, that's
Medellin.
the
So
another. Yeah, that's the big
yeah,
case study. Yeah.
yeah, the big case study. And so typically as an urban planner, I was completely thrilled by these amazing sidewalks, right, pedestrian walks, which were actually considerably, at least they seem to be considerably broader than the sort of the right of way that you've just you know, described. And on that there were paths for pedestrians, and then there were paths for bicyclists. But of course that was, I think that perhaps is very much an exception, because I haven't even seen something like that in European cities. So
No, it's not
that's
possible.
yeah.
Excepting
It's just not
Amsterdam,
possible.
excepting Amsterdam, parts of
Okay.
Germany,
It's
Denmark.
essentially it's so the thing is, for example, ITDP, not to particularly name a sort of international NGO, but there are typically street redesign, let's just say, guidelines that exist. Lots of them, lots of drawings. They cut a section through the street and they show how it can incorporate public transport, this, that, and the other. Most of these street design guidelines do not exist for roads below a certain width, because they can't. It's too site specific. That's where you need designers to actually do it on site. You cannot design in terms of guidelines and sort of these kind of broad spectrum solutions below a certain width of road, because you have to look at exact like situations, like are there exits onto the road, are there spaces, that are there parks next to it, are there shops next to it, is it mixed use, is it houses? So that's where you actually need to move away from this kind of guideline approach or like best practice approach, and you really
Yeah,
need to
but
work with the city.
one
uh,
one one kind of struggle that I have with spatial planning in that sense is we are constantly taking what is fixed in a neighborhood in that layout of the urban design map as our starting point for the intervention. Whereas if you look at the way traffic rules are decided, I mean, Amsterdam city center, you have to pay a lot of money to get parking in, and you don't have parking. You know, the entire city center canals are not car friendly canals. You know, we just haven't taken into account people's livelihoods when we make these plans, because if there are roads where buses are not prohibited, if you have roads where large trucks are not prohibited, if you have roads where you force traffic to slow down during school timing, surely there's a way to work out even a time to take into account, the cycling traffic, especially not a commuter traffic so much to say, but a traffic for whom cycling is livelihood. The kind of people I explore in this film, but the kind of people I also study as an anthropologist. Surely there's a way and a means to, instead of rearranging the road, instead of saying we need dedicated cycling lanes for every road, surely there's a way to rearrange our thinking, and the maps with which we are thinking about urban space to take into account mobility patterns.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nosheen, you were.
Yeah, so Joseph has posted a question, and I wonder, Joseph, if Manas's earlier, what he had articulated earlier about urban design answers your question. But I'm going to put this question out there in any case. So Joseph asks, is there room in cities like Kolkata that would give urban planners the opportunity to design multimodal streets that could safely support multiple forms of transportation? So that has been the focus here in the US. However, I acknowledge that the cities here are far less populated. So I'm just wondering if Manas has in fact answered your question, Joseph, in that sense.
Also,
I
very
just
quickly to convey to Joseph that, the city of Calcutta is also expanding into the more rural hinterland. And all of that is coming with cycling design tracks. The city has also expanded into a new township, a satellite township called Rajarhat. And that has come with cycling tracks. So whatever is happening in terms of city expansion is now factoring in cycling tracks, which is one good news. But I think Manas is also more well equipped to talk about what do we do with existing
No, I
roads.
just want to add that this is now, I mean, this is sort of well known that the US has a very different planning context, but more importantly, the US has a very different history in terms of street design. Right from
Mm,
its inception, there's something called a gridiron pattern, and
right.
that's typically what has been used in the US. And there's another term which we often use for the US, which is survey before settlement versus every other like historic settlement in the world, the cities that predate planning per se or predate these sort of scientific professions are settlement before survey.
Mm,
So US has the opportunity, also has had the benefit of having had these land speculations which have then settled the city, and so the streets were already wide. In fact, by the time many of the cities started growing, carriageway was already a thing, as opposed to many, many cities, and particularly in South Asia and generally in the global South, but also in Europe, where you have to deal with streets that are way older, much narrower. You can't just let them, you can't just negate them. So it's also a matter of, can we do it? It's more importantly for me, it is, we have to do it. We have to find a way of designing for the existing spaces rather than trying to say, oh, this is done. Let's just, it's like saying Shah Jahanabad, which is the older part of Delhi, is a slum, which is what they did in the 1960s. So we can't do that. We can't just reject older spaces of the city, because that's where these people really need, these kinds of solutions.
mm, mm.
So Manas, that is such a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous point, and thank you so much for bringing the historical aspect into it. Right, that context matters and histories matter, and the United States example is perfect in that sense. So I was thinking that in the context of the South Asian city, and by no means do I intend to sort of homogenize. So we see sort of the dynamics of informality, which are very important. Um, Informal settlements, kachi abadis, chopris, bastis, that it's a diverse language, diverse vocabulary that we use often to define the places of the urban majority. And there's question of opacity also is, I think the issue of opacity also is a very important one. And often there is a vast disconnect, at least definitely here in Pakistan's urban centers, and Karachi is an exemplar in that context, a vast disconnect between what planners see and what actually is happening on ground, right? At the neighborhood level, at that very, very molecular level. And this disconnect is largely also because sort of where the informal is seen as chaotic is very much devalued. I mean, in Africa now, the conversation has really, progressed considerably more, I think, and perhaps to some extent in India as well, that informality should be embraced. There is, despite the fact that there are certain pitfalls in that argument, but there are ongoing conversations even in India amongst academics and activists and planners, that you have to value the kind of informal that unfolds on ground, vis-a-vis the vernacular neighborhood design, street layouts, its relationship with mobility. But here in Pakistan, this conversation is sorely lacking, right? In Karachi, it's actually nil, absolutely nil. And this then makes our efforts as activists, as academics, particularly challenging. How do you engage the planner, the developmentalist, especially? Now, of course, the World Bank has come into this, this entire terrain in a very big way, where it's setting up these participatory forums, which are actually, in my opinion, more like enclaves for the privileged. So having these conversations becomes particularly hard. You can't pull the World Bank representative down all the way to the, to that local sort of context. It's a very, very hard thing to do. So then again, that slippery slope comes up again, right? So how do you start these conversations? So at the Karachi Urban Lab, this is kind of what we endeavor to do, but we find it very, very challenging, very, very difficult to do, essentially. So we had, put aside 90 minutes for this event, and we are now closing in at 12:30 Pakistan time. And I don't want to keep. Yes, Malini, you want to say something?
Yeah, there's a very interesting question on electric bicycles.
Oh yes,
Yasser has asked this question, and I want to briefly respond. Thank you, Yasser, for raising this question. There are a few startups in India that are looking into electric bicycles, and I think I particularly welcome them in a way, also for ordinary people. And if we have ways and means to make this available to not just the privileged and the elderly, but also to make this available to people who actually use their bicycles to ferry cargo, I think we can take a very right step in the direction of a sustainable future. So e-bikes, I think, and e-bikes, the sale of e-bikes globally went up massively during COVID. The other thing that Umna has raised is about milk vendors delivering milk on motorbikes instead of bicycles. I think it also talks about social mobility, and Manas is also writing about how people who were earlier dependent on bicycles, once they have better jobs and better circumstances, actually move on to a motorcycle. So, I don't feel we've lost an environmental battle when I hear about social mobility. So thank you for bringing up that topic. I think we've addressed all the questions. Nosheen?
Yes.
Are there any missing?
No, I don't think so. Sajad, I think we've addressed all the questions that our participants posted, and of course we are recording this conversation, and we will make it available online for those who wanted to join us but couldn't do because the timing is such. And I thank our panelists, Manas Murthy and Malini Sur, for joining us today in this, well, I think, fabulous conversation and such a thought-provoking and incredibly wonderful film. And I hope, Manas and Malini, that we will sort of be able to set up similar kinds of events in the future, whenever the future happens along these lines, and invite others to join these conversations that are so important, and especially the issue of design, Manas, which I think often it really kind of gets very easily marginalized in the broader discourses of urban planning and development and remaking cities and and mobility and all of that. How do you kind of take that neighborhood, that again, that very molecular aspect of the city, and issues of design. How do you bring it in, into conversations? So thank you both for such, such fabulous insights and for such thought-provoking, conversations. And Sajjad, thank you for organizing all of this. And thank you for our participants for posing excellent questions and for your comments. I hope you enjoyed this session. And so goodbye. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, all the panelists and all the attendees for your time. And it was an interesting conversation. Hope that we'll arrange these kind of conversations in the future as well. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.